So I actually decided um, between the lessons because the pen keeps acting up weird. I decided to write it all out before recording this last section. So bear with me. All the notes are already written on this, but I am going to go through all the important stuff as well as things that aren't written down, but I would talk about anyway. So yeah, bear with me. There'll be less of the awkward waiting moments. So obviously, chapter 10, the last chapter of this section that we're talking about, is drug use and delinquency. And so, first thing right off the bat we need to talk about is substance abuse, because drug use is part of it, but drug abuse is the bigger issue. And so, substance abuse is the misuse of drugs or alcohol to cause physical harm to one's self. So, it's one thing to use drugs, it's another thing to misuse drugs. I'm not saying, hey, go out, do drugs. That's not what Mr. Wheaton's telling you. It's saying that, in particular, we are talking about misuse. We're talking about the abuse side of this. And so, important to note. Um, but our textbook goes into, excuse me, a very long section going drug by drug, talking about things. And I have the real broad strokes pieces about this that I want to talk about. It's not important for me to write down every single piece. You can write down what you feel is the most important from the chapter. I'm just going to say some things. So, as far as marijuana is concerned, the impact on humans in the long term is still unknown. Obviously, we have a lot of different studies over the last few years about the positive impact of marijuana, in particular on PTSD, on pain management, things like that. But we're still unsure on the long term effects on humans, so that's still something that's up in the air. Cocaine is actually naturally occurring, in case someone didn't tell you that. Hence why original Coca Cola did have cocaine. It's part of the cocoa plant. Anyway, not getting into that, but cocaine is naturally occurring. Crack is the street made mix of cocaine. It is a synthetic version of it. So, but obviously, cocaine, while naturally occurring, is still not great for the body. Heroin is the most common narcotic and most abused drug out there. That's why heroin tends to be brought up a lot, especially when we talk about musicians who die of drug overdose and things of that nature. Alcohol is the most popular drug among teens. If you're like, well, how is alcohol drugs? Um, it is a depressant. It does desensitize the body, things of that nature. So it is a drug. So is nicotine and cigarettes, and that's something we'll talk about as well. Or rather, might as well just say it now. Cigarettes are a big thing, especially since they've now changed the legal age that you can buy a cigarette. That too has also made an impact on that. Um, this textbook was written before that change, so I'll be interested to know how that plays a role, at least here in PA. So, anesthetic drugs are things that depress the nervous system. Most commonly is PCP, also known as angel dust. Inhalants are volatile liquids that give off vapors and, when inhaled, produce short term excitement. Uh, yeah, these tend to be uh, things like, if you've not heard of the term poppers before, be glad that you haven't, but that's something that was a constant thing as far as that. There are sedatives and barbiturates, which are downers. They're usually identified by their color. Uh, do you have any reds, blues, things like that? Tranquilizers are relaxation and to reduce anxiety. Obviously, there are, the important thing to note about these and some of the others is that they can be medically prescribed. They can. The problem is when people abuse them, or take them when they're not supposed to. Hallucinogens, the most popular one that people tend to know is LSD. Obviously, it changes your state of mind. Stimulants, also known as uppers or speed. The big one that people tend to know is meth, and the important reason why I need to talk about this, other than Breaking Bad, is meth is extremely dangerous because it can be recreated with relative ease, but is highly unstable. Um, Meth is a problem because you can make it with pretty much a lot of everyday substances you can find at a house. The problem is when you mix them together, it is a chemical reaction and it can lead to a volatile explosion. That's why meth lab explosions are a real thing. That's why you can actually look it up. There are statistics on meth labs and meth arrests across the country. Erie County has a decent number. Pennsylvania has a decent number. Like, this is a problem. So yeah, just want to put that out there. The steroids, obviously, when we talk about them in regards to delinquency, we're mostly talking about muscle growth steroids used by student athletes trying to get an upper edge in their chosen sport. However, long-term effects, much like marijuana, we're not super sure on. We do know that there are some negative effects to taking steroids for a long period of time. We're just not sure how long down the road these effects take place and things like that. And so, when I mentioned parties earlier, some of these are definitely what would be quote unquote party drugs, but I also want to bring up designer drugs. These are synthetic drugs that are meant to get around the law, at least temporarily. So it's like, well, you're not allowed to have this or this or this. So you create a drug that technically doesn't do those things, but if taken a certain amount, it can. And you say you don't take too many, but you take too many because you're told you're not supposed to. Yeah, designer drugs are meant to be the get around the law. The most popular one and most well known is ecstasy. Ecstasy is the quote unquote party drug. It mixes combination of different aspects of some other drugs that are meant to make you pretty much relax and enjoy and have hypersensation feelings and things of that nature. I'm not speaking from experience. I've never taken ecstasy and I never want to. But just putting that out there, like, that is the party drug. That is what it's known as. All right. That got through very briefly all the different categories of drugs. The important piece to note, regardless of anything else, is that everything that's I listed is illegal. Obviously, like I said, some things can be prescription drugs, and those are obviously legal, but the misuse of them is illegal. So across the board, no matter what, how you're approaching this or whatnot, they are illegal. They are an important thing to note. But the less important piece, I guess, is to know that this is a problem and it does have an impact on juvenile delinquency, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. So, there are 3 surveys that our textbook brings up: the MTF survey, the the Pride survey, and the NSDUH survey. I call it the NISDA, but they're monitoring the future, Parents Resource Institute for Drug Education, and the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. And so, truly, the takeaway is that these are 3 different surveys that all track the rates of drug use and demographic data across the nation. So it looks at age, it looks like gender, it looks at ethnicity, it looks at all these things, and across the board, it looks particularly at drug use. And so, as of 2014, when the book last mentions this survey and this data, it showed that there was a decreasing trend with very few exceptions across the board. So it was showing that typically juveniles were using, or rather abusing, drugs less and less. So that's the good news. The bad news is, again, that was 2014. I don't know the current demographics because, well, I did not find that number in my own research. So I'm sure I can find it, and if I do, I will let you all know. So, yeah, the takeaway is that we do have data out there that shows us these larger trends. Obviously, one of the big issues with this is that, well, the question comes up: how many juveniles are going to actually be involved with this and willingly admit what amount of drugs they're using and things like that? So There is some issue with the data, whether we can trust it or not, but in general, the general rates show that it's a positive change. And so the textbook even puts forward the question, so why take drugs? And you can find the summary of typical reasons why on page 281, but it breaks down to 7 reasons why uh, a juvenile delinquent might take drugs. The first one is social disorganization. We've talked about this before. Social disorganization is where things in life and in your area are disorganized, not working, and because of this chaotic nature, it tends to lead towards some kind of negative aspect. So when this social disorganization is high, when life is bad, it's easier to turn to drugs to kind of deal with it. Obviously, the peer pressure, following right up with our last piece about schools and about peers, the peer group is important. And if you want to fit in and your friends are doing drugs, you're going to do drugs too. It's the unfortunate peer pressure aspect of it. Now, people don't always do, and that's awesome, but it is something that needs to be recognized as a legitimate potential reason why someone does drugs. Um, the family factors, sometimes this is the family is so bad and so hard to deal with that individuals will use drugs as an escape. Sometimes it's that your family members also do drugs, and so it's very common and easily accessible in your own household, and so you do drugs. Sometimes it's the family has a history of drug dealing and things like that, and so you follow it. Like, family factors can play a huge reason as to why a juvenile falls into uh, the drug world. Obviously, genetic factors. These are the weird behind the scenes DNA things about you that you just can't really help. Notice that 5 is emotional problems, and under there is addiction prone personality. Obviously, that is a genetic factor, but that is also an emotional thing. And I wanted to emphasize this one in particular, which is why I wrote it down as a separate piece. But addiction prone personality, there are people that are more likely to be addicted to something than others. It's just the nature of it. So if you're a person who does not have an addictive personality and you can try anything once and you're like, okay, yeah, I'm good, that's awesome. But there are people that if they try something once, they're hooked. And that is something that if you know that's a problem, you try to avoid situations where you'd be put into it. And so sometimes individuals who are these addiction prone personalities, they take drugs possibly just from a peer pressure situation. Sometimes it's a family factor. Sometimes it's a rational choice. Sometimes it's social disorganization. Like sometimes it's one of those other things, but because of their addiction prone personality, that becomes the problem. And that's what leads them to do it more and more and more. So it's important to note that, yes, it is its own separate thing, but it is also tied into others. And that's why I wanted to emphasize it separately just a little bit. Obviously, problem behavior syndrome, this is where it is one problem of a pattern of things. It is not just one thing, it is everything. This is just one onto the many problems and of the many things that are going on that leads to this moment. Um, then, obviously, like I said, I put rational again in quotes here because when we talk about rational choice, we really mean that they're making the decision to do it. They're not coerced, no peer pressure, no social disorganization, no family factors, nothing. They're just like, you know what? I want to do drugs. It's the rational choice. Again, rational in quotes. Um, all right. And so then we need to talk about the pathways to drug abuse. And so, in particular, our text talks about how there are some particular pathways in which individuals get involved with drug abuse. It's not just, these 7 factors that lead to people taking drugs, but it's also, there are sometimes these pathways that we can see where it leads directly into that. And so the first one is often there's a gateway drug, and for teens and young adults, this tends to be alcohol. You start by drinking alcohol underage, and then it leads to marijuana, and then it leads to cocaine, and it spirals out of control. Um, while yes, that is very oversimplifying and demonizing all those things, that is the pathway that some people, especially those who have an addiction prone personality, um, starting on one thing and going to the next, that is a problem. Um, so obviously, another pathway potentially is drug dealing. If you are just dealing in drugs and not actually taking the drugs, it's the whole, you're surrounded by it all the time. So you might find yourself actually uh, taking part in it, and that can lead then obviously to full on drug abuse. And then other delinquent acts. Typically, if you're involved in one crime, the chances of you getting involved in another crime goes up, that kind of thing. So, um, but very quickly, if you notice, I put table 10.3 on page 285. It is the drug use, problem behaviors, and delinquency chart. And what it is a personal survey from children between the ages of 12 and 17. It's broken from 12 to 14 and then 15 through 17. And it asked specifically these individuals if they've drank within the past 30 days, used marijuana in the past 30 days, or have ever sold drugs. And what it does is they look at these age groups, and based off of if they've drank alcohol, used marijuana, or sold drugs, were they suspended from school, vandalized property, committed a major theft, was involved in an attack or assault, belonged to a gang, carried a handgun, or was arrested. And so it just kind of has this data. And so we see higher numbers, obviously, in those who have said yes to using marijuana, drinking alcohol, or selling drugs. We see that across the board, that anyone who has said yes, they did in the last 30 days do this, they tend to have a higher rate of being, yep, I totally did that. Yep, I stole. Yep, I vandalized. Yes, I got suspended from school. We actually get the percentage for the suspended from school. 52% of the youths aged 15 through 17 who said yes to using marijuana in the past 30 days were suspended from school. So, yeah, we have that data. So, this is where my segue to drug use, problem behaviors, and delinquency. Yeah, we see a higher rate of delinquent behavior and problem behaviors when there's drug use. Go figure. But there is a connection between drug use and delinquency. But what is that connection? And so I bring it up because the textbook even goes, we're not sure if it's drug use has a direct influence on delinquency or if delinquency has a direct influence on drug use. But there is for sure some data that shows that there is a connection. And so that's why it's important for us to actually dig into this and actually discuss this. And so that's what leads us into our last aspect of this chapter before we wrap up for the day and we briefly review things. And that is some drug control strategies. And so the law enforcement aspect of it, the law enforcement choice and idea is to limit access to drugs, target dealers in particular, and do better border control / close borders. If drugs can't come in, well, then drugs can't be sold and can't get access. So clearly, like I said, it's not that any of these work or don't work. It's just when we think about them in a vacuum, they don't work, any of them, but combined, there is potential. But yeah, so law enforcement's idea is all about cracking down harder on drugs. The educational decision, in particular, so like schools, these are things like the DARE program. And if you're familiar with the DARE program, you might know that it was a critical failure. There are plenty of reasons why and beliefs as to why it didn't work. If you're interested in that, I can recommend to you some uh, documentaries, some YouTube videos, things like that that talk about why the DARE program didn't work. Um, but do know that there's positives from it. It just the way it was implemented was not the best. Um, so the community aspect, if we remember, sometimes the community tends to be a little more social work related, and so their idea is their plan usually involves like the Boys and Girls Club and things like that, and the Smart Moves program. Smart does stand for something, and our textbook does lay it out for us. Smart Moves stands for skills mastery and resistance training. The idea is that you learn how to say no to drugs, not just the DARE program way, but you actually develop skills and you become a better functioning member of society. So obviously, there's something to that. Clearly, there's also the to control drug or strategies to control drugs use and drug abuse. Obviously, treatment and rehab programs need to be something that is thought of and developed a little bit more. Um, and then, of course, is harm reduction. And what I mean by harm reduction and what our textbook means by that is minimizing the harmful effects caused by drug use and some of the more punitive responses to drug use. So rather than outright getting rid of drugs, because that is seemingly an impossible task, there's a reason the war on drugs never worked and was never really a thing. It's because you can't have a war on drugs, but you can reduce the impact it has. And so these are just some of the typical strategies that can be utilized and are utilized in regards to drug control. So, as I said in the last one, uh, that this is the whole thing. This is our discussion of drugs. So, or wow, our discussion of drugs on delinquency. So, excuse me. To briefly review our whole giant piece. So, we talked about 4 different chapters, which focused on 4 different aspects of delinquency and how it's impacted by the family, by peers, by school, and by drug use. And so, our takeaway from delinquency and family is that the family is the first and major impact on children as they grow older. And so, when there is issues and there is abuse and neglect, there tends to lead to some kind of increase in influence on delinquent behavior. So the parents and the family members and all the aspects of the family make a difference in regards to how a child potentially becomes involved in delinquency. And as they get older, and they start going to school, they start to look towards their peers, the people that they spend time with, that this is their social group. They want to belong, and so they look for like people. And sometimes that means that they get involved with not great people, and that tends to be gangs. And sometimes being part of a gang is the best life because there's no other choice. Um, so that's an important piece to remember is that our peers have a decent impact on whether a child gets involved in a delinquent group or not. Um, the other thing is not only are peers a problem as far as school is concerned, but school itself also can have an impact on juvenile delinquency as we see the growing gap in success and particularly race and ethnicity. Um, that discipline is not equal, that education is not equal, and that sometimes when we track students, we go, oh, well, they aren't achieving as well as they should, so they're not going to go to college. And that impacts their social status. It makes them feel less belonging and could lead to delinquent lives, possibly joining gangs. And on the same level, with peers, but a uniquely school issue is bullying. Bullying is a type of abuse, and bullies have a history of antisocial behaviors so do school shooters, and a lot of school shooters have admitted to having some level of bullying done to them and wanting some sort of revenge. So, school in itself also can lead individuals to lead to a life of delinquent behavior. And then drug abuse, what we find is that while the rates of drug use has decreased among youths, what we find is that oftentimes if an individual is already delinquent or they have some kind of emotional problem, genetic factor, problem behavior syndrome, family factors, or even their peer pressure and social disorganization, they might start taking drugs, and then that too can lead to delinquent acts of drug selling, drug use, and anything else. So, yes, there's definitely a connection between drug use and delinquency, but is it one begets the other, or what else? Um, so, yeah, that sums up the whole thing. Um, Thank you very much for listening and working through this with me. Again, apologies that there wasn't something last week. I wanted you to really focus on the midterm. So, anyway, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I will see you in the next video.